Good day to everyone. What better way to relaunch the Steve Darlow Fighting High YouTube channel than this excerpt of an interview with the wonderful Reg Barker. Over a couple of decades I've been able to interview some fantastic Air Force veterans and recorded many of those interviews. And what follows is an excerpt from one of those interviews. I sat with Reg at his home in 2011. Now Reg was a pilot with Bomber Command, flew with 635 Squadron, and this is Reg telling the story of the night he was shot down in August 1944. I got to know Reg very well, delightful man, and was able to write up and publish his story in the book Last of the Kriegers. This will be the first of many clips from Reg's interview. Sadly, he's no longer with us. Families, friends and acquaintances certainly have fond memories of Reg's fantastic life spirit, which I think you'll see in this interview. If you enjoy the video, then there are plenty more already on the Steve Darlow Fighting High YouTube channel. Please like and share, and don't forget to subscribe to receive notifications of when we post more interviews. Now over to you, Reg. So we get to the night, 26th, 27th of August, where you were when you were shot down.
Yes.
And would you mind describing in as much detail as you can that particular night? If it's not too.
It's a long time ago.
Yes, but if you can just what you can remember, as long if it's not, because some veterans don't like to talk about when they were shot down. But if you.
Well, I'm well beyond that now.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, it was the summer of 1944, August, when the Allies were making great progress across France. They'd eventually broken out of the Normandy area, where they had been held up for several weeks. I always believed that the intention was on the first day to reach Caen, but they didn't manage it, and I think it took about a month. I think it took a long time anyway, and it was only eventually captured after we'd virtually destroyed it, and then they couldn't go through with their tanks and armoured cars because of all the rubble in the streets. But anyway, they'd broken through eventually the Falaise Gap. They'd come across France, and the day before we were shot down, the Allies had liberated Paris. General de Gaulle, personally of course, had liberated Paris, so they were on their way, weren't they? And we thought the war's not going to last much longer, another 3 weeks or so it could be over. They were well on their way to the Rhine, and good old Monty will be sorting them out in due course. Anyway, what happened? Our target was Kiel, a very important naval base for the Germans, because that's where they were launching their submarines against the Allied navies and fleets which were crossing the Channel, because all the armies we had in France depended on the ships to bring the supplies across, to keep them refueled, keep the supplies of ammunition, food, everything depended on the ships crossing the Channel. So they were vulnerable to the U-boats, and Kiel we knew to be a very important U-boat base. So anyway, we bombed Kiel, dead on time, thanks to our amazing Canadian navigator, who, as I told you, every 6 minutes produced a fresh fix and change of direction whenever necessary, or change of speed. So we bombed and we set off, and the gunners and the wireless operator would all be searching the sky, looking out for fighters. We'd left all the gunfire behind, of course, all the yak-yak and the searchlights. But suddenly there was a tremendous explosion. The aircraft was turned on its back. I managed to right the aircraft and called up each member of the crew to check that they were all okay, which they were. They all responded. We had a fire in the starboard wing, and only that week I had read of a crew who had managed to blow the fire out by putting the aircraft into a shallow dive, and the increased speed managed to force the wind to put out the fire. So that was a hopeful thing to do. Put the aircraft into a shallow dive, but almost immediately I'm holding the control, of course, here. Almost immediately, the nose went violently down. I realised, it began to go down. Perhaps it wasn't so violent. Perhaps it started going down. And I realised as I came back on the control that I had no control over the tailplane at all. It meant that over the ailerons, it meant that we had no choice but to abandon aircraft. So I gave that order to the crew. Anyway, the nose went right down and we found ourselves in a very tight spin, going vertically down, as it seemed to me, back towards the fires of Kiel. My last view of the altimeter was, we'd been flying at 17,000 feet, and my last view of it showed us to be down to 13,000 feet, and obviously we were going down at great speed. I had, of course, the moment we were hit and the right of the aircraft opened up for all 4 engines to maximum speed, 4 beautiful Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. So when you consider that they were behaving as perfectly as my experience had always been with the Merlins, they were wonderful air engines. We were flying vertically downwards towards the ground. Obviously was only seconds away from death, or from hitting the ground. It wasn't time to think much about it. But the force of G was so great that I was lifted out of my seat, aware that we were going to, there was no alternative actually but to hitting the ground. And I remember a sort of momentary prayer, God, to make it quick. I didn't want really to be fried up in the fires, did I? But this is split seconds we're talking about. There wasn't any time, Steve, for my life to pass before me. There wasn't any time for any of that stuff that we read about. I lost consciousness. But before I lost consciousness, what I ought to mention is that the moment I'd given the order to abandon aircraft, the bomb aimer was down in the nose, opened the hatch and he went out. But with the hatch opened, there was the most tremendous roaring noise of the wind through the aircraft as we were going down at this tremendous speed. It was absolutely deafening. I've never, ever, ever heard such a loud noise, screaming noise. 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines screaming away and the aircraft vibrating and the noise of the wind blowing through. I didn't at that time know that we'd lost our tail. That was why we were in this vertical dive, this vertical spin. And that was accounting for this terrible noise. So that was the end of Reg Barker, wasn't it? What happened next? Well, suddenly, from this deafening noise, there was total silence, and obviously that was when I blacked out, wasn't it? So I lost vision, lost hearing, everything was silent. Total silence. Reg Barker had arrived in that heavenly place to which he was obviously intended. But after a few moments of this amazing quietness, total bliss, this peace, suddenly there was a swishing sound, which I later realised was the wind tearing through my clothes as I was hurtling towards the ground. I was outside the aircraft, I was outside in the cold night air, and suddenly my vision came back, and there beside me, hurtling to the ground, was my blazing aircraft. And I think at that moment I realised I was in the sky, and instinctively my right hand went to the ripcord to pull it, but I hadn't got any feeling and it didn't work. So I put my left hand on it, pulled my glove off, and with my left hand pushed the right hand to pull away at the D-ring to release the parachute. And at that moment I saw the treetops brilliantly illuminated by the fire from my aircraft, and at that moment I dropped into the treetops. And I hung there for a moment and thought, well, I better not stay here, it's not a very good place to be, I better get myself down the tree. So from the top of the tree I managed to undo my, whatever it was that held me to the parachute, and clambered down through the branches, and eventually the branches gave out. So I then had my arms tightly around the trunk of this tree, and dropped and landed softly on the thick carpet of leaves which were there to receive me, and looked up at the night sky, and there was the pole star, which was useful because I knew that I wasn't very many miles from the Danish border. My instinct then was, well, I've got to get to Denmark, because that's where I shall find friends who will look after me. So I set off out of this wood, and when I got to the edge of the wood, I had to think what to do next. Well, I knew which direction I wanted to go, so I kept going in the right direction by crawling along a ditch. As I crawled along the ditch, I suddenly became aware of voices approaching me, and obviously they must have seen me silhouetted against the fire, which of course had set the wood on, the trees were on fire too, not just the aeroplane. And so a voice said something like, "Come with me," or probably, presumably in German. Sounded friendly enough, a very old man anyway. And there was a whole bunch of them, and they all surrounded me. Every age, well, they weren't any middle-aged people, they were either very old or very young. And they all grabbed part of my battle dress. The children were holding onto my trousers, all clinging terribly tightly to this British RAF Terrorflieger, as they called me. Well, you see, to me it was Terrorflieger. How could I be a Terrorflieger? I was here to liberate them, wasn't I? To liberate Europe from the Nazis, from Nazi heel anyway. You see things in very black and white when you're very young and in that situation. I felt so calm. It was an incredible feeling of calmness after knowing I was certainly going to be dead. That was the end of my life, no question about it. And it didn't panic me in any way at all. It's quite extraordinary. That was knowing before I blacked out that, the end was there. That was it. And all these people, they were so excited. But if you think that they'd heard my aircraft screaming down over their village, doing hundreds and hundreds of miles an hour, must have made a tremendous din. They must have been terrified out of their lives, mustn't they? And then they captured the Terrorflieger. So what were they to do with him? Well, anyway, one of them, a teenager, had a little revolver of some kind, a little pistol, which he had up at my head here with his hand shaking. And there was I, completely consumed with calmness. I felt sorry for these people, really. I mean, it was an extraordinary situation. Anyway, after a little while, they handed me over to they might have been Home Guard or something, and two men in uniform anyway. And I had to accompany them with my hands on my head. They gave me the odd kick, but nothing more than that. And they took me to a farmhouse of some sort, where it was taken up to the first floor. And I can remember looking out through the window, and obviously I could see it was a big farmyard, and a huge plate glass window. And I knew that if I were Errol Flynn, who was one of our cinema heroes in those days, I would at the right moment. I should mention, by the way, I was never left alone, of course. There was always a guard with me in the room. And they used to change over every few hours, and they used to love just to play with their revolver, thinking, if only this chap would take a running jump for the window, we've got him, haven't we? It didn't happen because I decided I wasn't Errol Flynn. And anyway, it wasn't, the plate glass window wasn't made of sugar, which they used in the films, it was made of glass. So I thought twice about that.